You're listening to Monday Science Podcast, the show that brings you the latest in science, technology, and health with your host, me, Dr. Bahija Raimi Abraham. Back to Monday Science, let's get straight in. So today's Monday Science Person of the Week goes to Dr. Katalin Kariko, and she's a Hungarian biochemist who specializes in RNA-mediated mechanisms. You probably recognize her name because Dr. Katalin Kariko's mRNA research helped pave the way for the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna's vaccines, COVID-19 vaccine. Her career history is just very, very interesting. So in 1990, whilst she was an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Katalin Kariko submitted her first grant application in which she proposed to establish mRNA-based gene therapy. And so ever since mRNA-based therapy, that's been her primary interest, and she was on track to become a full professor, but grant rejections led to her being demoted by the university in 1995. This I just this part of her story I found very, very interesting, because if anybody saw my Instagram post a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about the highs and lows, mainly the lows of grant applications and grant rejections. But anyway, so she was on track to become a professor, but because of the grant rejections, she was demoted by her university. And she stayed on, which I think is amazing, like really says a lot about her resilience. But she stayed on. And then in 1997, she met another professor of immunology who she actually worked together with as a collaborator. And their work described specifically how certain modifications in mRNA led to a reduced immune response. And it really says a lot about, the journey, as if I can talk of sort of the academic journey and the impact of having good collaborators and the right collaborator for impact with your work. So between her, Kariko, and Wiseman, they founded a small company, and in 2006 and in 2013 received some patents for the use of several modified nucleosides to reduce the antiviral immune response to mRNA. After this, the university sold the intellectual property to somebody else, somebody who was the head of a lab supply company. And then weeks later, a venture capital company that were backing Moderna contacted her to license the patent. And apparently all she said is, "We don't have it." Wow. Okay. And then in early 2013, Kariko heard of Moderna's $240 million deal with AstraZeneca to develop a VEGF mRNA. And so she then realized that she would not get a chance to apply her experience with mRNA at the university. And so she took up a role as a senior vice president. She was senior later on, 2019, but as a senior vice president for BioNTech RNA pharmaceuticals. What an inspiring story. And so, as I've said already, her work has really paved the way specifically for the Moderna and Pfizer COVID-19 vaccines. Amazing. So with the news update, and it's all a little bit COVID related. So you've probably been hearing in the news around about the risk of blood clots, and there's been also a parallel discussion about the risk of blood clots from COVID-19, but also the risk of blood clots for the oral contraceptive pill. But anyway, it's another day's discussion. So a study led by researchers at the University of Oxford has shown that the blood clot risk from COVID-19 is higher than after vaccines. So basically trying to say that there's more risk for blood clots in somebody who actually gets COVID-19 than it is if they have the vaccines. And so this is compelling evidence on why people should continue getting vaccinated despite the current concerns about extremely rare blood clots. The researchers use a database of electronic medical records of patients that were primarily based in the USA, to determine the risk of the rare and deadly blood clots called cerebral venous sinus thrombosis after vaccination versus infection. Of the 513, 284,000 COVID-19 patients identified in the database, only 20 developed this thrombosis within 2 weeks after their diagnosis. And this is compared to about 2 out of 871,000 patients who received an mRNA vaccine and developing a clot there. And the EMA, the European Medicines Agency's latest estimate for the risk of these clots associated with the AstraZeneca vaccine is 5 per million. Okay, so on to today's episode. So this is a part 2 episode with Dr. Zainab Gertin. Thank you so much to everybody for your comments and feedback after the first episode. And it seems as this topic of egg freezing and fertility seems to be of a lot of interest to people. So we are continuing this series as well. So in today's episode, we're talking about motherhood over 35, but more specifically, motherhood over 40, miscarriages, and impact of COVID-19 and fertility. We talked earlier about motherhood over 40, and I always remember hearing the phrase geriatric pregnancy for any woman who was pregnant over the age of 35. Is this still a phrase that's being used?
I think it is still a phrase, although most clinicians now have more sensitivity and tend to not use those terms. And actually nowadays, depending on where you are in the country, motherhood over 35 is in many places, certainly in urban centers, increasingly common. So, if you were a doctor at UCLH, so my institute at UCL is partnered with maternal health at UCLH. And if you're a clinician at UCLH, you probably won't be seeing many women under 35. So it will be the norm that, most women coming through will be over 35. That might not be the same in every part of the country, but certainly it's becoming much more common. And I think there is now greater sort of sensitivity in the language used.
Yeah, I just remember like geriatric. It's like, what? It's so offensive. And because I know you talk about the experiences of motherhood over 40, but I guess in a slightly, I'm saying my age now, but I'm interested to know, is there any difference in the experience of a woman over 35? Like, I guess the experiences of motherhood between 35 and 40. Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't sort of have firm data off the top of my head, but medically speaking, there are certain risks that increase as a woman becomes older. So we know that the risk of infertility increases. We also know that the risk of miscarriage increases. And then there are other conditions like gestational diabetes, preeclampsia that increase as the mother becomes older. But again, I was just recently talking to a clinician colleague who mentioned that there are also now many women in their late 30s and early 40s who do have perfectly healthy pregnancies and who do have, uncomplicated vaginal births, have very healthy babies at the end of it. So yes, some of those risks increase, but I think, again, it's important to kind of be aware of the fact that actually how severe are those risks and how many people will be able to moderate them.
It also feels there's a bit of a theme that maybe there needs to be more media representation of not I was going to say positives, but just more a fairer balance as it maybe relates to the wider communities, just of representation of women over 35, women over 40, people having children later on in life and just discussing it in a fairer sense, as opposed to perhaps the narrative that's been pushed now. So there's a general assumption that mothers over 40 are generally more anxious than younger mothers. What are your thoughts on this, and is this actually the case?
Yeah, I think that is actually the case. Although, of course, anxiety depends to a huge extent on what a woman's journey has looked like instead of just her age. So if a woman is in her early 40s and she's been lucky enough to conceive naturally soon after she started trying, hasn't had any difficult experiences or experiences of loss in the past, she might actually have a very comfortable pregnancy. But I see a lot of women who are having children over the age of 40 who have had quite complicated histories. In some cases, they will have been trying to conceive for a long time. They'll have been through multiple rounds of IVF, or they will have had miscarriages. And of course, if you're in that situation, you're going to feel, or most women tend to feel more anxious during their pregnancies.
And we've talked a lot about women, but is there much focus on men and parenthood over 40? We talked about sort of men themselves wanting to have children later on in life, but is there any, I don't know, data on their own attitudes to?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's really important. That's a really important point. And I always say, I do say, when I talk about my work, that we mustn't leave men out of the equation. And it's really important to bring men in. And then as a researcher, all my work is focused on women. So somebody needs to concentrate on men, and somebody needs to talk to them and find out their opinions. It isn't me, but we do need more of that information. And I think, yeah, there isn't as much research in this area on men as there is on women, for fairly obvious reasons. But also, where researchers have tried to get more information on men, they're much harder to recruit into studies on fertility and reproduction, because these things are seen as sort of female topics or women's topics. So even where we try quite hard to get men involved in studies, it's more difficult. But it's starting to happen. There are some social scientists out there who are really looking into men's experiences, and as you say, it's really important.
Definitely. I watched it. I guess I keep quoting all these documentaries, but I don't remember where the titles or where I watched them from. But I do remember watching a documentary about fertility, and they were talking about, there was in particular, talking about it from a male, well, couples, and then from the, if it was a same-sex couple or a heterosexual couple, the male perspective, and who was actually it wasn't to blame, but it was talking about everybody's assuming it's the woman who has the fertility problems, but actually these are the kind of challenges that men may have in
Mm.
terms of their fertility, that yes, they may still have, like they may have evidence of an ejaculate, so I'm saying that right, and then when you actually look under the microscope, there's no sperm, and just sort of that concept of how we just naturally assume that a man's fertility is always okay, and the first issue is when there's a sign of a challenge or anything, it's the view is, let's look and see what's wrong with the woman, but
Yeah.
actually how there needs to be maybe a fairer approach to assessing fertility is very, very, very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. That's so important. And actually, there has been major male fertility decline and decline in sperm quality. So at the moment, with heterosexual couples who end up in fertility clinics, it's about half and half. Those who come due to reasons to do with the woman, and those who come due to reasons to do with the man. And then there's a huge proportion where it's a combination of reasons, or the specific reason can't be pinpointed. But certainly, male infertility is as much of an issue as female.
Wow. And so just to finish off on the pregnancy over 40, so are there any misconceptions about pregnancy over 40, and is there anything we can do to destigmatize that?
Yes, I think that's a great question. The main misconception about older motherhood and pregnancy over 40 are that these are women who are selfish, or that they're career women who have prioritized their careers and have left having kids too late, and some very, especially in the tabloid media, some sort of very derogatory undertones about these women now wanting to have their cake and eat it, as if that's a bad thing. And really, that's, as I've been finding out in my research, that's so far from the truth. These are women, yes, in many cases they're very successful professional women, but what they will say to you is, I worked really hard in my career and I advanced because I didn't have a family. If I'd met the right person, I would have happily had a family. It's not necessarily that I put one in front of the other. And again, in many cases, it will be to do with relationships, not finding the right relationship. And in some cases, it will be, as I've said, that they've already been trying to conceive for a long time. It's not that they suddenly decided, oh, I think 43 is the ideal time to have a baby. It's just they had a long journey there. And really, in many cases, the women who are having children, especially women who are starting their families, having their first children in their 40s, they're incredibly conscientious. These people, it's not that they didn't care about motherhood, it's that they really wanted to enter motherhood in the right circumstances, when they were financially stable, when they had reached a position in their career, not just for the sake of the career, but for the kind of life they'd be able to offer a child, for the kinds of opportunities they'd be able to offer a child. So they are sort of they've been very thoughtful and very conscientious in some ways. So I think it's really important to not be judgmental and stigmatizing about other people's life choices, least of all because we don't know anything about what their journey has been necessarily.
I completely agree. I'm just going to say we've got the miscarriage, reproductive anxiety, and the impact of COVID, but I can reduce that a little bit just 'cause I'm conscious of the time. So probably
Yeah,
about
maybe
10.
just do the miscarriage and
Yeah.
then, yeah.
Yeah. So would you like me to
Yeah.
just to do the miscarriage and then move on to impact of COVID and fertility?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, let's do that. Perfect. Sorry, I just thought I'd add that in. Okay, great. I'm loving this. Okay,
Thank you.
it's amazing. Okay, so thank you so much for that. In November of last year, the Duchess of Sussex revealed that she had suffered a miscarriage of her second pregnancy. And I'm going to quote to you now in your article in the guide that you wrote in the Guardian, which was very, very interesting. And you said that although miscarriages are surprisingly common, experienced by approximately 1 in 4 women, there continues to be a I'm gonna have to edit that. Sorry, I won't say that part, but I'll say that part again. So in the article, you were highlighting the fact that miscarriages are very common, experienced by approximately 1 in 4 women, but also it seems to still be a taboo subject, and this is partly because 85% of miscarriages occur within the first trimester, most likely before women publicly announce their pregnancies. So why are miscarriages so difficult for society, for people, for women to process and also to accept miscarriages being
Mhm.
common?
Yeah. It's actually incredibly sad because I think there are these difficult experiences we go through in life, miscarriage definitely being one of them, which are made all the more difficult because they're silenced and because people feel they have to deal with it sort of on their own. And you know that's what it means for something to be taboo or stigmatized or not discussed in society. So we have this 12-week rule, this 12-week social rule, although I think a lot of people are beginning to question the wisdom of that. So before that period, if a woman hasn't told anybody that she's pregnant and then she miscarries, she's really, in many ways expected to just deal with that as if nothing has happened. And again, I think how attached a woman might be to a baby growing inside her is nothing to do with necessarily the number of weeks, but it might be to do with, how longed for that baby was, how hard they've tried for it, how excited they were to have it. So there are women who suffer miscarriages at 6, 7, 8 weeks who are devastated because they really imagined, mothering that child. There might be other women who experience miscarriages and don't see the fetus as a baby and don't have the same responses. So it's a very individualized situation. But the fact that there's a silence around it, and it's certainly not a socially polite topic to raise. It makes other people feel uncomfortable. It makes other people not know what to say or how to respond, means that those women who would benefit from being able to talk to others or sharing their experience miss out and have to kind of deal with it on their own, which seems kind of like an unnecessary additional level of pain to have to go through.
Yes, definitely. And in some cases, I guess as an outsider, you may only find out that somebody experienced a miscarriage when they have their second baby, and they say, oh, like their rainbow baby. You're like, oh, and it's again how people talk about it, but not talk about it at the same time.
That's so true. So there are, as you said, there are two main ways in which you might learn about someone having a miscarriage. One might be a close friend. Once she has a baby, she might tell you that it hadn't been that easy, or she lost a baby in the past. And I think it's easier to talk about it in that way because then there's the happy ending of the healthy baby who was born. And then the other thing people say is sometimes when they experience a miscarriage, and if they disclose that to close friends, and then suddenly they'll find out, oh, so and so had one too, and so had one too. And because it is so common, one in 4 women, that's incredibly common. So when one person starts the conversation, I think then a lot of other people might reveal that they'd had similar experiences. But it's a shame that women don't know where to turn before they've experienced it themselves, an experience that can be really lonely.
Yeah, and I was even that was actually going to be my next question. So, what I mean, do you have any suggestions as to how one could support more women to find out about it, talk about it before it, if it before it happens? I don't know if that's the right way to word it, but just how do we get more conversation about miscarriages and opening up that discussion there?
There are two levels. There are two levels at which that could occur. One of them is like the personal interrelational level, where if we each give our friends a little bit of space to truly express where they're at, and we're willing to kind of sit with the things that make one another sad as well as the things that make one another happy, that's just a very basic interpersonal level in which we might cultivate more open, more honest, more supportive friendships. But really the issue is bigger than that, and I think there's a structural level in which change can come and tackle taboos. So New Zealand just became the first country last week to introduce paid leave following a miscarriage, which is, that's a really important milestone, because what that says is that we're honoring the experience, and we're honoring that not just physiologically, that a woman might need time off, and a lot of women do actually need to take time off. It can be a physically brutal experience, but also psychologically you might need some time off. And by allowing people to take paid sick leave after a miscarriage, that's a validation that this is something we understand, appreciate, that happens. We validate that it happens.
It's even just acknowledging, it's New Zealand have been doing New Zealand and Australia have been doing some very interesting and amazing things for women. Thank you for that. So we're just wanting to move on to, as we said, the elephant in the room, COVID-19, the pandemic, still here. And I was just wanting to find out a little bit more about your research in this area, and I guess if you can share any insight you might have on the impact of, and I'll say COVID-19, but impact of the pandemic on fertility treatments and maybe access to treatments.
Yeah. So this pandemic that we are still living through, and will have reverberations for some time to come, I imagine, has had a huge impact on all of our lives. Huge impact. With regards to fertility, it has had several, knock-on effects. So I know that for single women who were looking to find partners, it's increased a lot of anxieties, because it's made it in many ways much more difficult to meet somebody when you're stuck in your own home, and where there are restrictions on going out and that sort of thing. So I know that a lot of single women who were already feeling anxious about meeting someone, etc., feel that that's been a heightened anxiety. Women and couples who were going through IVF treatment, they had a lot of disruptions to their treatment. During the first lockdown, fertility clinics were closed and it wasn't handled very well. So huge amounts of anxiety regarding what their journey was going to look like, how long the clinics were going to stay closed for. Luckily in the UK now, all the fertility clinics have reopened. But there are still, capacity is down, because of course clinics have to keep social distancing measures in place, etc. And I think more broadly, there have been, since the beginning of lockdown, there have been these slightly flippant comments of a lockdown baby boom. And I think we haven't seen that reflected in sort of stats and data. I think we probably need a little bit more time to find out if that's the case. But certainly, thinking about the kinds of people I tend to work with, or I tend to focus on, these jokes around a lockdown baby boom have added insult to injury and have made some people feel quite left out, and like their experiences have just not been represented. Yeah.
I thought that was a bit of a childish narrative to put forward, that there would be this random why. It just seemed as if it came out of nowhere and just became this inappropriate running joke that isolated so many people and didn't even include people as well, so if people who may have, gotten pregnant during this time, it's like, oh, you were one of those. It's like, no, it's just, it was a very weird narrative that was
Yeah,
being.
I mean, it's kind of it's a kind of strange assumption that being incredibly worried about your loved ones and a global pandemic and financial
Exactly.
aspects was going to be the best aphrodisiac.
Ooh, talk more. It just doesn't work that way. And we just on this subject, do you have any data on how COVID has affected not just the fertility patients, but actually the impact it's had on their relationships?
Yeah, so that's actually a part of the data we've been looking at right now. We're just going through it. And interestingly, um, while some, of course, many fertility patients felt really anxious and nervous and stressed about having to have disruptions to their treatment, some of them actually also found that that kind of enforced rest, especially for people who'd been having treatment for quite a while, was kind of a welcome break. And in some cases, people mentioned, our respondents mentioned that actually it was quite beneficial for their relationship. And we did have, in a survey of 501 people, we did have two couples who naturally conceived while they were
Oh,
dealing
fantastic.
with disruptions to their IVF
Fantastic.
treatment. So it works out very well for them. But I think in general, what was really striking was that even though this was a very stressful time for people, fertility patients mentioned that their partners were a huge source of support. So what we really saw was, partners supporting each other through this difficult time and difficult experience.
That's really interesting. So like a coming together, of the and a strengthening of the relationship. Because
Yeah.
another narrative that was put forward was for, I mean, I guess it was a blanket statement that for lots of people were breaking up during the pandemic because they were forced to spend this excessive amount of time together, and issues
Mm.
and cracks in the relationship were coming to light. But again, I don't know if that was based on any data or just a
Yeah, I mean,
narrative.
intuitively that sounds that sounds like there might be some truth in it. Just a time of increased tension and anxiety might make relationships more difficult. But certainly for fertility patients, what we found, the predominant finding from that group was that partners were very supportive of one another through that experience.
That's really nice to hear. And please let us know when you publish that data. So sorry, I'm like adding
I
pressure,
will.
but
No,
please let us know,
absolutely.
because it's something I would really want to promote and just share, because we need more reputable, sound data on anything to do with COVID and related, just, yeah, I did an
Yeah,
episode about
absolutely.
retractions and COVID retractions. So please do let us know, and we would love to just share that with our listeners as well. And so, in terms of fertility, there's been a lot of discussion about the impact of the COVID-19 vaccines, whichever one, on fertility. And, I was saying there was a recent guidance that was published by the Association of Reproductive and Clinical Scientists, as well as the British Fertility Society, that confirmed that there was absolutely no evidence that COVID-19 vaccines affected fertility of women or men. I don't know what
Mm.
your thoughts are on that. Have you come across even people in anybody asking you these questions as well, and needing verification?
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been so many inaccuracies and some scaremongering ideas going around about the vaccine. And certainly there seems to be absolutely no truth behind some of those rumors that the COVID vaccine has an impact on fertility. And it's unfortunate because, of course, that's something a lot of people would care about and would make a reason for them to feel very cautious about the vaccine. But no, absolutely no evidence behind that claim.
Yeah, no, it's good to just reinforce that, and especially highlight the data, the evidence that goes to support that. Because I've even had friends ask me those questions, and I'm
Mhm.
like, from what I can see, no. And then I look and I'm getting like, read this paper, except they're like, why would I read it? Just tell me. But thank you so much. We're coming to the end of the interview. And I've got just a few more questions I want to ask you. So I guess one thing we've talked a lot about sort of UK and Europe, but in terms of as it relates to fertility, but I just didn't know if you might have any insight into different cultures' attitudes to fertility and fertility treatments.
Yeah, the different cultures' attitudes to fertility treatments is a growing area of research among reproductive sociologists and reproductive anthropologists. And of course, really questions around reproduction are at the very heart of what make us us, or what make our culture our culture. So unsurprisingly, different cultures have very different ideas about um, what they think is acceptable, what they think is not acceptable, what they think is preferable or not preferable. Of course, most cultures have an interest in trying to promote healthy fertility and, healthy family relationships. But there's a huge amount of variation across the globe in terms of how assisted reproductive technologies have been accepted and kind of the rules and regulations around them.
It's very interesting because I think also, as you mentioned at the start of the episode, that with declining fertility rates, it's not just going to be something that we have to think about in the UK, and fertility is something that women all over the world have to think about. But then if their desire to explore some of these fertility treatments that are available is there's a clash with cultural attitudes and perceptions, that must create a whole different dynamic. So be interesting to see what data comes about from that, but maybe how I say we, I'm not in your field, but how we can support more women to make informed decisions that they choose, not sort of influenced by a negative perception or misception. And so what do you feel is the future of fertility
Mm.
and future fertility needs?
So I think most researchers fall into one of two camps in terms of what they see as the future of fertility. One camp feels that we now have increased technology and increased proliferation of different technologies, egg freezing, and then lots of different gene editing technologies, etc. So one camp would argue that it's going to get more technological and more varied. And I think the other camp might argue that actually, I think we might see the pendulum swinging a little bit, by which I mean that possibly the next generation will start having children earlier than our generation and may therefore need less technological intervention. So I think it'll be interesting to see. I think the positive and kind of the really remarkable aspect is that reproductive technologies were introduced to deal with fertility issues, medical fertility impediments. And actually what we've seen across the last 40 years is that they've enabled lots of different families to come together, same-sex couples having children, solo mothers being able to have children. And of course, people having healthy children where that might have not been possible beforehand. So I think all of those are incredibly positive. And I think that kind of different family forms will continue. But I think that we might see a trend for earlier motherhood in the next generation, if for no other reason than because people of our generation are going to want to see our grandchildren, which is
Yeah.
not going to be possible if our children end up having their children in their
Children.
40s.
Yes. Oh gosh, I didn't think of that. Well, thank you for that insight. And do you have, I mean, what would you say are your take-home messages from everything that you've said and we've discussed today?
Hmm. Um, So I think one take home message is, if you are a single woman who's in her late 30s and you're feeling like you wanted to be married and you wanted to have children by this point, and what have you done? And, have you made some wrong decisions? I think one take home message is you're absolutely not alone. You're part of a broad social change, and there are many other remarkable and amazing women like you um, who are finding themselves negotiating these sort of slightly new questions. So it's not because of anything, you've done wrong. It's just we are sort of seeing changes to the patterns of relationships and reproduction. And another take home message would just be that there is information out there and increasing information, but it's really important to be discerning about where you get that information. So if you want to find out about fertility treatments or success rates or egg freezing, then in the UK, we're really lucky to have the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. So I would head over to their website and just be aware that in the private sector, there might be maybe some more financial motives that have an influence on how things are discussed or marketed or advertised.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Monday Science podcast. Make sure to visit our website. Details are in the episode description, where you can subscribe to make sure that you never miss the show. So catch up with you next week. Bye.